Hi there, and welcome to Living Inspired with Autism. I'm your host, Antoinette, and today we're diving into something that might just change the way you think about your role in your child's journey. This episode is the hidden connection between self-care and your child's progress. I was away for the weekend, so please excuse my voice. But I will try and get through the podcast without it breaking. So here's holding thumbs. Okay, so here's something I never expected to discover as an autism parent, and that's the way I care for myself directly impacts my child's development. Not in that vague greeting card way we've all heard before, but in specific, measurable, sometimes really surprising ways. I remember sitting in yet another doctor's waiting room, flipping through a parenting magazine, when I came across one of those, those generic self-care articles. The ones, take a bubble bath, get a massage, find some time for yoga. And I actually snorted out aloud, startling the receptionist. Because the gap between that advice and my reality as Max's mom felt so enormous that it wasn't just unhelpful, it was almost offensive. That night, after another particularly challenging bedtime routine, putting Max to bed for the 10th time, it just left me completely tired and depleted. And I found myself wondering, am I going to be able to keep this up? Is it sustainable? Can I really do this for the long haul? And most importantly, is my perpetual state of exhaustion affecting Max's progress? That question launched me on a journey that fundamentally changed our lives. Not because I suddenly found some magical pockets of time for spa days, but because I discovered the neurobiological connection between my well-being and Max's ability to thrive. And that's what I want to share with you today. So let's start with something fascinating that researchers have discovered. Our nervous systems don't operate in isolation. They're in constant conversation with the nervous systems around us, especially those of our children. Dr. Stephen Porges, I think that's how you say his name, who developed the polyvagal theory, describes something called the neuroception. Our nervous system's ability to detect safety or danger without conscious awareness. Now, our kiddos, particularly our autistic children, who may be more sensitive to subtle cues, are constantly picking up on our nervous system state, even when we think we're hiding our stress perfectly. I experienced this firsthand during a period when I was overwhelmed with work, and I was also trying to manage all things Max, and I thought I was holding it together pretty well, putting on a brave face, going through all the usual routines. But Max's behavior shifted dramatically. His sleep deteriorated, and the progress we'd made in communication seemed to kind of stall. And it wasn't until an honest conversation with his OT that the connection actually became clear. Because she explained that children co-regulate with their caregivers. So if your nervous system is constantly in fight or flight, it's almost impossible for his to find safety. And this really hit me like a ton of bricks. In my effort to do everything for Max, pushing myself beyond my limits, I was unintentionally creating an environment that made it so much harder for him to thrive. And my depleted nervous system was sending constant signals of danger to his already sensitive one. And the research backs this up. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders found that parental stress levels are directly correlated with intervention outcomes in autistic children. Higher parent stress equals lower child progress, even when controlling for other factors like intervention type and intensity. But this connection goes beyond just stress levels. When we're exhausted and depleted, certain capacities that are essential for supporting our children's development become compromised. Think about presence, that quality of being fully available in the moment. When we're running on empty, true presence becomes almost impossible. We might be physically with our kiddos, but our depleted brains are scanning for threats, they're ruminating on worries, or they're simply struggling to process information effectively. I noticed this with my interactions with Max was I was going through the motions of our connection activities, following all the steps his therapist had outlined, but something was missing. You know, that spark, that mutual joy, that true connection that previously just made our moments together like the best ever. Now, this matters because presence is the soil in which the connection grows, and connection is what drives development, especially for our kiddos who may connect in ways that differ from the neurotypical norm. Our full presence is essential for recognizing and responding, for them to be able to engage. Then, of course, there's the cognitive flexibility, our ability to adapt in the moment, to shift approaches when something isn't working, to see creative possibilities in challenging situations. Research in cognitive neuroscience shows that sleep deprivation and chronic stress, constant companions for most of us parents, significantly impair this exact capacity. In one of Max's therapy sessions, which was quite difficult, he wasn't responding to the usual strategies. And the therapist just effortlessly pivoted, finding 3 different approaches until she just discovered what would work that day. And when I asked her how she knew what to try, she just said something I will never forget. She says, well, I'm well rested and I'm regulated. I can access my creativity. But when I'm tired and exhausted, I can only access what's right in front of me. Now that phrase, when I'm exhausted, I can only access what's in front of me, perfectly captured my experience. When I was running on empty, I could only follow the established protocols, even when they clearly weren't working. So the flexible, creative, and responsive parent Max needed was unavailable because I was just too exhausted. Here's something they don't tell you at a diagnosis. Parenting an autistic kiddo requires more internal resources than typical parenting. And not because our children are burdens. They absolutely are not. But because the role demands more from us in very specific ways. Think about the executive function load. We're managing complex medical and educational systems. We're coordinating therapies, we're documenting progress, we are researching interventions and anything autism. We're implementing things at home, we're preparing for transitions, we're creating visual supports, and we're also advocating, the systems that weren't designed for our children. Then there's the sensory and the emotional regulation that we provide. And many of our children need help to navigate the sensory challenges and also the emotional ones, because we serve as external regulators, helping them cope with a world that often feels overwhelming. And this requires a huge amount of emotional resources on our part. And then, of course, let's not forget the vigilance, the heightened state of alert many of us live in, constantly scanning the environment for potential triggers, preparing for and managing challenging situations, and then being ready to step in at a moment's notice when our child signals distress. Now, each of these demands draws from our internal resources. And unlike certain physical resources, which may have clear empty signals, we know when our gas tank is empty or our bank account is depleted. Our internal resources can become dangerously low before we recognize the warning signs. So what does this look like in real life? Let me share how this understanding has transformed things for us. So after the conversation with Max's OT, I started paying more attention to the connection between how I'm feeling and his progress, or how he acts in a day. So I began to keep simple little notes, tracking how I was sleeping, what my stress levels were like, and what I was doing in terms of self-care alongside his therapy, and how he was progressing and how he was acting. The pattern emerged with undeniable clarity. The weeks when I was the most tired and exhausted were invariably the weeks when Max struggled the most and made very little progress. Conversely, periods when I had more support and I was able to better maintain my self-care corresponded with him being a lot calmer and being more in tune with his development. So one example stands out. We had been working on some communication goal for months with like minimal progress. And Max would use his communication device during structured therapy sessions, but rarely initiated that communication spontaneously at home. And we had tried everything that the specialist suggested, but we didn't get a lot of change. So during this time, I was running myself ragged, staying up late, trying to figure out what to do, waking up to prepare stuff before school, using any free moment to fit in, more time to practice. And my husband finally staged what he jokingly calls an intervention, and insisted that I just take 2 full days off while he handled everything. So I agreed, and I spent the weekend with a friend in a nearby city, and I slept uninterrupted for the first time in months. I had conversations that didn't revolve around therapies or school or education or any of that, and I remembered aspects of my identity beyond being Max's mom. And when I returned home, something remarkable happened. Like within a few days, Max began using his device spontaneously, first just like once or twice, and then like with increased frequency. And the skill that we'd been pushing so hard to develop suddenly just popped up. Not because we found some magical new technique, but because I returned more regulated, present, and I was more responsive parent. His therapist wasn't surprised. She just said children make progress when they feel safe, connected, and engaged. Because when you're exhausted, it's nearly impossible to create that environment consistently, no matter how many techniques you know. Now, this might sound like I'm building up to the same old advice. Take more bubble baths, find time for yoga, schedule that massage, but I'm not, because I understand the reality of our lives. Traditional self-care often feels impossible for us as parents. We're dealing with limited time, limited childcare options, limited financial resources, and sometimes limited support systems. And these standard approaches aren't wrong, they just don't account for our specific conditions. So what I'm advocating for is this fundamental shift in how we view self-care, not as an indulgence, not as something separate from our parenting responsibilities, but as an essential component of our child's support system. So when I realigned my thinking this way, everything changed, because self-care wasn't something I did despite being an autism parent. It was something I did because I was an autism parent. It wasn't in competition with meeting Max's needs. It was a prerequisite for meeting them effectively. This shift allowed me to get creative about what self-care could look like within the constraints of our lives. So rather than waiting for those elusive large blocks of time, I began looking for replenishing opportunities that could coexist with my daily reality. Now, for example, I discovered that there are certain sensory experiences that regulate both Max and myself simultaneously. So we created like a sensory reset corner in our home with tools that work for both of us. specific music, lighting, textures, and scents. When either of us needed regulation, we would go there together, meeting his needs while replenishing my resources at the same time. In summer, it's outside. Max is on the trampoline and I'm on the lounger with a good book. I also became more strategic about how I used the small fragments of time that were available. Instead of filling every spare minute with something to do with autism, I began designing certain time blocks, even just 10 or 15 minutes, for activities that specifically restored my energy. Not generic self-care activities, but things that I identified through careful observation that help my nervous system regulate. And perhaps most importantly, I also started viewing support from family, respite services, or other parents not as an occasional luxury, but as an essential infrastructure for Max's development. Just as we wouldn't question the necessity of his speech therapy or his educational supports, I stopped questioning the necessity of regular breaks for me as his primary support person. As I made these changes, we began to see a ripple effect throughout our whole family, because the most obvious was obviously in Max's developmental progress. Because when I was more regulated and present and responsive, he made breakthroughs in areas we'd previously felt stuck in. And it wasn't that I was doing more. In fact, I was actually doing less, but with better quality engagement. But the benefits extended beyond measurable development progress. Our relationship deepened. I found myself truly enjoying our time together more often, not just because I'm going through the motions of the connection activities. I could see him more clearly, noticing subtle communication attempts I probably would have missed if I was operating from exhaustion. So our family dynamics improved as well. My husband and I have more capacity for connection with each other rather than just tag teaming responsibilities. And the household atmosphere obviously shifted from constant crisis management to something more sustainable and even at times joyful, or more joyful. Perhaps most surprisingly, my capacity for advocacy expanded, because when I wasn't constantly tired, I could approach challenging systems with a lot more strategy and become less reactive. I could sustain long-term perspective needs for effective advocacy rather than getting lost in the urgency of immediate battles. So I could see the big picture rather than just the battle that was right in front of me. So where do we go from here? How do we translate this understanding into practical changes that acknowledge our real constraints of our lives? First, I want to invite you to shift your perspective on self-care, to view it not as something separate from your parenting responsibilities, but as an integral part of how you support your child's development and care. This mental shift alone will reduce the guilt that often accompanies taking care of your own needs. Next, become a detective of your own energy patterns. Start noticing what specifically depletes you and what restores you. This is highly individual because activities that rejuvenate one person might deplete another. And the goal is to identify your personal resource. What drains you, what replenishes you. Then have a look at the creative ways that you can integrate resource replenishing activities into your existing routines. Can you create sensory environments that regulate both you and your child? Are there support strategies that meet their needs while also preserving your energy? And can you stack self-care onto necessary activities rather than trying to find additional time? And then consider tracking the relationship between your well-being and how your child reacts, even in the simple ways. It's going to give you concrete evidence of the connection that can help prioritize your self-care as a necessary component to support your child and not a luxury. And finally, expand your concept of support. Many of us hesitate to ask for help, viewing it as an admission of failure and weakness. But effective autism parenting isn't meant to be done in isolation. Whether it's through family or community or professional services or connection with other parents, building a support network is one of the most powerful ways that you have resources for your child. So as we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with this thought. You and your child deserve more than just survival. You both deserve the opportunity to thrive. For too long, the narrative around autism parenting has focused on endurance and sacrifice and pushing through at all costs. We celebrate parents who give everything to their children, even at the expense of their own well-being. But what if the most powerful gift we can give our children isn't our exhaustion, but our wholeness? What if by caring for ourselves, we're not taking something away from them, but giving them something essential? A regulated, responsive, creative adult who can truly see and support them as they are. The research is clear. The connection between parental well-being and child development is real. When we shift from merely surviving to actually thriving, we create the conditions that allow our children to do exactly the same. This isn't about perfection. There are still going to be difficult days and times when we operate from exhaustion and tiredness because that's just what the situation demands. But by understanding this connection and making even small changes to honor it, we can transform our experience of this journey, not just for ourselves, but for our beautiful kiddos. Thank you for joining me today on Living Inspired with Autism. If this episode resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. And you can reach out through our website or you can send me a message and we can continue these conversations. This is Living Inspired with Autism, where we transform survival into thriving, one small step at a time.